I'm sorry, I never got the chance to know you.
They were wrong.
They told me you were dead.
The first time you stood beside me, I couldn't protect you. This time, I'll spend the rest of my life making sure you never need to be afraid again.
3 years ago, the kingdom of Frostmere watched its alpha king, Kale, die. His coffin was sealed. His crown was mourned. And his kingdom moved on without him. Or so they thought. Back to the present. Ravenhollow was starving, and the kingdom had offered a cruel solution. An Omega bride would be married to the dead king in an ancient covenant, and in return, her people would be spared. That bride was Elara. She was told Kale had been dead for 3 years. She was told there was nothing beneath the black veil of his coffin but a corpse. But as Elara knelt beside his bier, trembling beneath her wedding veil, something impossible happened. She felt a pulse. And before she could pull her hand away, the blood from her trembling finger touched the king's skin. The candles went out. The chapel fell silent. Then the man everyone had mourned for 3 years opened his eyes. Elara had no idea that Kale's death had been a lie. She didn't know that Lord Veyron had poisoned the king 3 years earlier and sealed him in a death-like sleep after Kale refused to surrender Frostmere's Omegas. And she certainly didn't know that she had been chosen for this marriage for one reason. Her blood was the only thing capable of waking him. But the moment Kale opened his eyes and saw his Omega bride standing over him, the kingdom that had buried its king was about to discover that their greatest mistake was believing he would stay dead. Subscribe so you don't miss the moment he wakes, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. I read every single one and I'd love to say hi. 3 years earlier, no one in Ravenhollow could have imagined the winter that was coming for them. By that winter, the village had stopped pretending things would turn around on their own. It arrived slow, the way ruin often does, a poor harvest, then a poorer one, then a frost that came weeks too early and killed what little the fields had left to give. Elara worked the family bakery from before sunrise until her hands went numb, stretching a fistful of flour into loaves thin enough to see light through, portioning bread not by what was fair but by who looked hungriest that morning. She told the children waiting by the shutters that tomorrow there would be more. She had stopped believing it herself weeks ago. The soldiers rode in on a gray Tuesday, crimson cloaks and polished steel out of place against the dull white of the square. Elara stood at the back of the gathering crowd, flowers still dusted across her sleeves, and listened as a young officer unrolled a decree stamped with the royal seal. The kingdom would provide grain and protection through the winter and beyond. In return, any village that wished to receive it need only offer one thing: an unmarried Omega, to be sent to Frostmere Palace and bound in marriage to the Alpha King. The dead Alpha King. The words moved through the crowd like a cold wind. Mothers pulled their daughters in close. Someone near the front laughed, sharp and disbelieving, and someone else told them to hush before the soldiers heard. An old man spat into the snow and called it a mockery to drag a corpse into a wedding vow just to feed a starving village. Nobody stepped forward. Nobody offered up a daughter to marry a man 3 years in his grave, no matter how much grain the crown was willing to trade for her. Elara went home that night to a house with an empty larder and a mother who hadn't eaten properly in a week, though she claimed otherwise every time Elara pushed her own portion across the table. She lay awake listening to the wind test the shutters, thinking about the officer's words: any village that wishes to receive it. Not everyone had to send someone. Just one girl. Just one name, and the whole of Ravenhollow might survive until spring. The elders came for her 2 days later. They didn't ask so much as inform her, gently, the way people speak when they've already decided something and are only waiting to see if you'll make it difficult. Elara had no father to object on her behalf, no betrothed to complicate the arrangement, no family powerful enough to protect her from being the obvious, convenient choice. She sat across from 3 old men in the village hall and understood, with quiet clarity, that this had never really been a question. Only a matter of who. She thought about the children at the bakery shutters. She thought about her mother's untouched bread, pushed back across the table night after night with a small, tired smile. She thought about a village that had already buried too many people this winter, and how many more graves there would be by spring if nothing changed. "I'll go," she said. The words came out steadier than she felt. One of the elders exhaled like he'd been holding his breath. Nobody thanked her, not really. Gratitude would have meant admitting what they were asking her to give up, and none of them seemed willing to look that directly at it. Her mother wept quietly when she was told, the way of someone who has learned that loud grief changes nothing. She held Elara's face in both hands and said the world didn't deserve a daughter who would trade her whole future for people who would forget her name by summer. Elara didn't argue. She only hugged her mother tighter and said nothing about the cold feeling settling low in her chest. The convoy came for her 3 mornings later. A modest carriage, 2 soldiers, and a stiff, unreadable escort named Sir Rowan who helped her inside without quite looking at her, as though she were something fragile he'd been ordered not to break before delivery. The village gathered to watch her go. Nobody cheered. A few pressed small things into her hands as she passed, a carved wooden bird, a scrap of ribbon, a heel of bread someone clearly couldn't spare. She held each one in her lap as the carriage pulled away, watching Ravenhollow shrink into white distance until the smoke from its chimneys was the only thing left to see. She didn't cry. She had promised herself she wouldn't, not until she was far enough that no one would carry the sight of it back to her mother. The road to Frostmere stretched on for 3 days, through forests gone silver with frost and villages smaller and hungrier than her own. Sir Rowan answered her questions with short, careful sentences that told her nothing. When she asked what the king had been like, his jaw tightened and he said it wasn't his place to speak on it. When she asked how he had died, he told her, flatly, not to ask that question again, not to him, and not to anyone once they reached the palace. She noticed how people spoke of King Cale when they thought she wasn't listening. Servants at the inns dropped their voices. A stable boy crossed 2 fingers over his chest at the mention of his name, an old gesture for warding off something they feared might still be listening. Nobody spoke of him the way you speak of a man who had simply died. They spoke of him the way you speak of a wound that never quite closed. On the 3rd evening, the towers of Frostmere Palace rose out of the frozen hills, pale stone and black iron against a bruised winter sky. Elara felt the strange, small thing in her chest tighten further. Somewhere behind those walls was a coffin, and a crown, and a dead man she was about to marry. She was brought through the palace gates the following morning, past guards who watched her with something closer to pity than curiosity, and into a great hall lit by hundreds of candles despite the daylight. It was there she saw the portrait, Cale, painted twice the size of any man, standing in black and gold armor with a wolf's crest behind him, his expression carved from stone. He looked powerful. He looked intimidating. And yet something in the set of his mouth, the tension around his eyes, looked almost lonely, as though the artist had captured a man carrying a weight nobody else could see. Elara stood before it longer than she meant to, and for one unsettling moment she felt the strange, foolish urge to apologize to a painting. She was dressed the next morning in an ivory gown stitched with pearls, her hair pinned beneath a thin gold circlet, and led through the corridors toward the royal chapel by women who would not meet her eyes. Sir Rowan walked ahead of her in silence. The chapel doors opened onto candlelight and cold stone, onto rows of silent nobles and armored guards, onto stained glass glowing faintly blue in the morning light, and onto the black ceremonial coffin resting at the center of it all. Cale lay within it in dark royal armor trimmed in gold, a crown resting against his dark hair, his face pale and still and, despite everything, beautiful in a way that made her chest ache. Elara had expected to feel nothing. She had told herself, the whole ride to Frostmere, that this was a formality, a transaction, a corpse she would be bound to in name only. Instead, standing over him, she felt an inexplicable pull, as though something in her chest recognized something in his. A robed priest began the ancient vow. A steward warned her, in a low voice just before the ceremony began, never to touch the king's bare skin, that the dead were to be honored, not disturbed. Elara barely heard him. She knelt beside the bier as the vow demanded, and when the moment came for her to lay her hand over his, she found herself whispering instead, so quietly only he could have heard it if he were alive to hear anything at all. "I'm sorry I never got the chance to know you." A single tear slipped free and landed on the back of his hand. His fingers twitched. Elara froze, certain she had imagined it, certain grief and cold and exhaustion were playing tricks on her, but she did not tell anyone what she saw. She simply sat with the memory of it, a small cold stone dropped into still water, and let the ceremony carry on around her as though nothing at all had happened. The weeks that followed settled into a strange, hollow rhythm. Elara was given Kale's old chambers, a suite of rooms untouched since his death, still smelling faintly of cedar and old parchment. It was there that Lady Mara found her, an elderly woman who had served the royal household for decades, who moved through the halls like a ghost the new court had forgotten to notice. Mara spoke carefully at first, testing the silence before she trusted it, but once she began, the stories came freely. "Kale," she said, "used to leave sacks of grain outside the doors of families too proud to ask for help. He had quietly funded the care of omegas abandoned by their packs, built shelters no one credited him for. Once, during a brutal winter much like this one, he had given his own fur-lined cloak to a starving child in the market square and walked back to the palace in nothing but his tunic. None of it matched the man the current court described in passing. Cold, tyrannical, a king the kingdom was better off without." Elara found herself doubting the official story a little more each day, and one evening, searching through an old writing desk for parchment, she found his journal instead. The handwriting was steady and unhurried, the entries plain and unguarded in a way that made her feel like a trespasser. One line, near the final pages, stopped her cold. "A crown is worthless if the people beneath it are starving." She read it 3 times. Then she began to wonder, for the first time with real unease, who had truly wanted a king like that dead. It didn't take long to notice she was being watched. A guard who lingered too long outside her door. Footsteps that paused when hers did. One afternoon she returned to her chambers to find her belongings subtly disturbed. The journal moved an inch from where she'd left it, a drawer not quite closed the way she always left it. She said nothing to anyone. She simply began being more careful about where she read, and when. Behind a shelf in Kale's old library, she found a passage she was certain no one else knew about, a narrow gap behind a false panel, half hidden by the dust of disuse. Inside, she found a small room lined with old documents, records that should have been sealed in the royal archive rather than tucked away where no one would think to look. Among them, a death certificate bearing Kale's name. Dated, she realized with a slow, sick understanding, 3 full days before his body was ever recovered and brought back to the palace. No royal physician's seal. No examination recorded. Just a signature, and a date that made no sense at all. She heard footsteps in the corridor outside and barely had time to slide the panel shut and press herself into the shadow of a bookshelf before a guard passed, his lantern light sweeping close enough that she held her breath until it faded. She didn't sleep that night. She lay awake turning the certificate's date over and over in her mind, aware now that whatever had truly happened to Kale, it had nothing to do with what the kingdom had been told. That night, when sleep finally took her, she dreamed of ice, a vast, frozen expanse stretching endlessly beneath a colorless sky, and beneath the ice, dark and still, the shape of something enormous. A wolf, chained and silent, its eyes the only thing still burning beneath the frozen surface. As she stood over it in the dream, the ice beneath her feet began to crack, spreading outward from where she stood as though her presence alone were enough to break it. The wolf's eyes opened. They found hers through the ice, and in a voice she felt more than heard, it said the only word it seemed to know. "Elara." She woke gasping, her hand pressed to her chest, certain, impossibly, irrationally certain, that something beneath Frostmere Palace was no longer entirely asleep. Subscribe to see what Elara finds next, and comment where you're watching from. I'll be replying to as many of you as I can. Deep beneath the royal chapel, in the cold dark of the crypt where Kale's coffin had rested for 3 years, something had begun to stir that had nothing to do with the body itself. His flesh remained still. His breath remained shallow and slow, barely a whisper against the silence. But the wolf inside him, the ancient, furious thing chained beneath his human skin, had started, faintly, to wake. It came in fragments at first. A pull, like a thread tightening somewhere behind his ribs. A sound that wasn't quite sound, drifting down through stone and silence, a voice, soft and unfamiliar, apologizing to a man it didn't know. Fear, sharp and metallic, brushing against senses that shouldn't have still worked. Kale could not open his eyes. He could not move his hand. But somewhere in the dark, chained ice of his own mind, his wolf lifted its head for the first time in 3 years and turned toward the warmth of something calling it home. Elara didn't understand what was happening to her, only that it was happening. She found herself drawn back to the crypt again and again under invented excuses, and each time she stood near the coffin, a strange warmth spread through her chest, as though she were standing too close to a fire she couldn't see. She began asking careful questions of the old physician who still kept Kale's private records, and what she learned made her blood run cold. The poison that had taken him wasn't ordinary. It was old, older than the kingdom itself, a venom brewed specifically to trap an alpha's wolf spirit inside a frozen body, leaving him neither alive nor dead. And there was only one known cure. The blood of a true mate, offered willingly, could break the binding. Elara sat with that knowledge long into the night, turning it over like a stone too sharp to hold comfortably. She wasn't merely his bride in name. She might be the only thing standing between Kale and an eternity trapped beneath the ice of his own body, and she had no idea whether she was ready to be anyone's key to anything. She went looking for answers the next morning, and found Lord Veyron instead, waiting for her in the library with the kind of practiced warmth that never quite reached his eyes. He asked after her comfort. He asked whether the palace had been treating her well. When she asked him, carefully, about the details of Kale's death, his expression didn't change at all, which was, she realized too late, exactly the problem. He didn't bother denying it once she pressed. He told her plainly, almost proudly, that Kale had been offered a choice 3 years ago: hand over control of Frostmere's Omega population to strengthen alliances with the neighboring packs, or be removed as an obstacle to peace. Kale had refused. So the court removed him. The marriage covenant, Veyron explained, had never been about saving Ravenhollow or honoring an old tradition. It had been engineered, a mechanism to draw the one bloodline capable of breaking Kale's binding directly into the palace, where the Moonblood ceremony could finish what the poison had started and destroy his wolf permanently, once and for all. Elara understood, with sick clarity, that she had never been a bride. She had been bait. She turned to run and made it only 3 steps before the guard seized her arms. Veyron's voice followed her down the corridor, almost gentle, telling her it would be easier if she didn't fight. They dragged her into the crypt as the sun set, and the chamber that had felt sacred to her only weeks earlier now felt like a tomb built specifically for her. Veyron stood over Kale's coffin with a ceremonial blade, chanting words in a language Elara didn't recognize, while guards held her fast before the altar. She fought anyway, twisting, clawing, driving her elbow into a guard's ribs hard enough to loosen his grip for 1 precious second. It was enough. In the scramble, a blade meant to restrain her instead opened a shallow cut across her palm, and before anyone could stop her, her hand came down against Kale's. The chapel went silent. 1 heartbeat. The guards froze mid-motion, uncertain, watching the coffin instead of her. Another heartbeat, stronger this time, audible even to the people standing farthest away. Then Kale's eyes opened. What came next was not gentle. His wolf tore free of 3 years of imprisonment all at once, a roar that seemed to come from the stone itself, rolling up through the crypt and into the palace above until every candle in Frostmere guttered and died at once. Veyron stumbled back, the ceremonial blade slipping from his hand. Kale's fingers closed around the edge of the coffin, and though his body was weak, starved of movement for 3 years, trembling with the effort, he pulled himself upright, chains falling away from wrists that hadn't held their own weight in longer than Elara had been alive. The dead Alpha King rose. He was pale, and shaking, and far from the powerful figure in the palace portrait. But the moment his eyes found Elara across the chaos of the crypt, something in his expression sharpened into pure, immediate focus. Veyron barked at his guards to finish what they'd started, to kill them both before the wolf fully returned to its strength, but Kale was already moving, placing his weakened body directly between Elara and the first blade swung her way. He caught the guard's wrist with a grip that still carried 3 years of fury behind it and threw the man aside like he weighed nothing at all. Elara stared at him, breathless, blood still welling from her palm. "They told me you were dead," she said. "They were wrong," Kale answered, and even exhausted, even barely able to stand, there was something steady in his voice that made her believe him completely. The fight spilled out of the crypt and through the lower halls of the palace as the household guard, confused and frightened, tried to decide who to defend. Elara didn't wait to be told what to do. She remembered the hidden documents, remembered which corridors led to the cells where Veyron had quietly imprisoned the soldiers still loyal to Kale's memory, and she ran for them while Kale held the crypt stairs against Veyron's remaining men. One by one, the loyal guards spilled free, armed and furious, and the tide of the fight began to turn. Word moved through Frostmere faster than anyone could have controlled, servants whispering it to guards, guards shouting it to soldiers, until the whole castle rang with a single impossible sentence: "The king is alive." Veyron, seeing his support collapsing around him, abandoned the fight and fled toward the throne room, and Kale followed, Elara close behind him despite the blood still staining her sleeve. Veyron didn't get far. Kale found him at the foot of the throne he had never been entitled to sit upon, and for a long moment neither man spoke. Then Kale, quietly, told him exactly what everyone in that hall already suspected, that a king who starves his people to protect his crown was never fit to rule one, and that Veyron's crown, built on a lie and a coffin, was already finished. By morning, the truth had spread through every corner of Frostmere. Veyron and the officials who had helped him were stripped of their titles and taken into custody, and though the surviving nobles pressed Kale to have them executed on the spot, he refused. He ordered a public trial instead, insisting that a kingdom rebuilt on secret killings was no better than the one Veyron had made. Word was sent to Ravenhollow within the week: grain, protection, and support, not as payment for a sacrifice, but as the standing word of a king who intended to keep it. And within the month, Kale dismantled the ancient covenant entirely, ensuring no Omega would ever again be bound to the crown against her will. Elara chose to stay. Not because the mate bond demanded it, and not because she owed Frostmere anything after everything it had put her through. She stayed because somewhere between the famine and the coffin and the crypt, she had fallen in love with a man the whole kingdom had tried to erase, and she wanted to know the rest of his story, not just the beginning of it. Kale found her one evening in the chapel where it had all started, standing before the same altar where she had once knelt beside a corpse in an ivory gown. This time, when he took her hand, his fingers were warm, and steady, and very much alive. "The first time you stood beside me, I couldn't protect you," he said quietly. "This time, I'll spend the rest of my life making sure you never need to be afraid again." Elara looked up at him, and for the first time since the soldiers had ridden into Ravenhollow all those months ago, the cold feeling in her chest was gone completely. She had been sent to Frostmere believing she would become the widow of a dead king. Instead, she had become the woman who brought her Alpha King back to life. Subscribe if this ending gave you chills, and comment where you're watching from. I want to know how many of you are here from the very first part.